So thanks everybody for joining this webinar on asset mapping. We're excited to do it. We thought we'd start by just learning who's on the call a little bit and go around and have you tell us your name and where you are and which organization you're affiliated with and one of your gifts of the hand. So something you're good at doing or making or creating. So I'll start. I'm Ron Dwyer-Voss. I am in Oceanside, California, which is north of San Diego. I am a consultant to the Community Catalyst Project with April's team. And one of my gifts of the hand is I like to do landscaping and move rocks around and plants and make areas that are peaceful for meditation and stuff. Well, cool. Thanks everybody for joining and connecting. Very creative group, artists and food makers and knitters. We've got an agenda for today to go through a model of, asset mapping that I've used over the years with agencies to highlight what agencies can do. And then we're going to hear from Danté. Okay, I got a slide here you can see. There we go. Here's some of their practice in Seattle, which was pretty cool. Then we'll break into some small groups and got some prompt questions so people have a chance to talk and learn from each other. So the idea today is really to show you a general way that agencies can convene and facilitate asset mapping, and then have some time to discuss how it might work for you. Does that work for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
When I'm working with groups to do asset mapping, and this webinar is going to be focused around 4 primary purposes. There's a lot of reasons you might do asset mapping and might want to engage community around this process, but for me, these 4 are pretty essential. The main purposes for the type of asset mapping we'll be talking about today are here: reveal and discover or uncover the strengths of a community, especially its residents and their associational life. And I put them at the top because there's a lot of processes that might, and a lot of other places where people might highlight sort of the physical strengths of a community or the institutions or resources in a community. There's not a lot of processes that lift up residents and their informal associations, but we find when we're working on strengthening communities from any number of angles that those are often the most powerful levers. So asset mapping is a great process to start to reveal that. The second is to develop a sense of empowerment and community pride among participants. I've never done the model I'm about to show you without having people from the community say, I've never felt so proud to live here. I'm overwhelmed with opportunity and possibility. The process itself that we'll talk about will develop a sense of empowerment for the people who participate. And then it also provides some real data for people to imagine the action that they can take as a community. So it's a great blend of sort of feeling good about the community and what it has to offer, but then also imagining what action people should take. For me, asset mapping is a tool for shifting power and for taking action. And if it doesn't lead to that, then it's generally becomes a fairly academic exercise. And then the last one, which is essential for taking action, is to guide future relationship building. And then we get in a bit of a cycle here where the future relationship building helps discover and connect more assets, creating even more power. So at the end of the day, for me, asset mapping is about power and about shifting power into the hands of residents and community associations in a community so that they can imagine and take the action that they want to take in their community. So because, well, let me go back. So these purposes are very resident-centered. And so often the question becomes, well, what, if we don't want to have institutions continue to have control over everything, what is the role of institutions? And so this process is one that is agency-led because there is a really valuable role institutions play. And there's a number of steps to that. Thanks for the note to speak up. I'll keep trying. I see 4 primary steps that agencies and institutions like libraries can help with. One is convening and hosting. Often an agency, especially a library or museum, is a trusted institution in the community, and if they convene and host something, people trust that it'll be worth their time. Then framing what it is important, otherwise this thing can go all over the place. And then doing the mapping, and then helping folks determine what action they want to take based on the map they created. And we'll go through those steps in more detail here in a minute. From there, I found 2 things usually happen. One is that people will come back later after they've taken some action and refresh their map and reconvene and update it. They have more community partners now, more relationships, and so it makes sense to bring folks in and say, is our map current? There's things we hadn't thought of that we want to add to it. And then what's that mean for our action going forward? So it becomes a cycle. I've also seen where a group may spin off from this and become the gardening group. And they saw the assets in the community, they saw vacant lots, they saw people interested in gardening, they saw people interested in fresh and healthy food that they didn't have great grocery store access to. And so they spent off to do that project with the assets, but then within that, they did more asset mapping and they went around the community to find people who were interested in this and that's something to do. So it can cycle on itself or it can spin off new incarnations, and you'll see how that happens as we go. Let's look at this first step because this is really an important one for that agencies can play, this convening and hosting. This is, picking a place, being facilitators of the process. A lot of times it's helpful for, quote, an outside party, which, even though an institution might be physically in a community, the people who work there might be from outside the community. And sometimes it's helpful to have them facilitate and doing the invitations, reaching out. I'll use some examples here of a couple of recent asset mapping events that I helped with public health agencies. And they often had coalitions of other agencies that were involved, social services, youth development, et cetera, the usual suspects. And we had them think about who are the residents in your community who are connector leaders, meaning people who are connected to lots of other residents. And they all know somebody. And so bring them, invite them, but not a mass email, but a direct invitation. So when somebody from the community clinic calls and says, hey, we've met, or somebody from the school calls and says to a parent, I'm part of this process, we're gonna, interested in making the community a healthier place, and there's gonna be this fun event where we look at the assets of the community, do you wanna come with me? Then people come. When they get an email, they don't come. So that's a whole nother webinar on community engagement, but for asset mapping, it's really important to do direct invitations and follow up. And when it sort of has the endorsement of the library or museum or school behind it, then people trust that their individual relationship with the person they're inviting, as well as the host, makes it a worthwhile decision to leave home that night and go there. And then all the logistics. It's just so important. These are all things that could be obstacles often to initially residents pulling this off themselves that institutions can really just sort of clear the way for and create a space where residents can really engage in the meat of the process, which is what comes next. So once you get folks there, and I really emphasize when I'm working with agencies, try to make sure there's 2 or 3 residents of the community for every agency staff person who's there. That ratio helps create some power balance and really helps the group get to some authentic and sincere sharing around. I think that's what we had done too when we did it with the youth, right? It was about 3 or 4 youth for every adult, and it worked really well in spite of the natural power dynamics. But once you're in there, it's important to frame it. And the framing that I recommend is pointing out that to help people understand every community has assets and that needs never really solve the problem. So this process is about identifying the things that we might use to create solutions and to create the community we want. It's always helpful, and people always appreciate hearing that this is something that communities around the world have found to be empowering, have found that it leads them to action, that has given them some independence from outside forces or decisions. You don't have to wait on the government to do something or an agency to do something once you have an asset map. And so that's just reassuring for a lot of folks that all kinds of communities around the world have done this process. And then reviewing the 6 asset areas and clarifying their definitions. So making sure people understand the difference between institution and association. Residents are filled with assets, the physical environment, the local exchange and economy, and culture and stories. And spending a little time with that. And I think at the end of the slideshow, which you'll get a copy of these slides, are slides you're more than welcome to use that kind of help guide people through that. And I sometimes use slides, sometimes I'm in like a machine shop or a church basement, and we just might have a simple drawn handout with a couple bullet points, but just to help people understand the difference. And then it's good to have people think about the boundaries of the area being mapped. In asset mapping, if you're focused on a particular neighborhood, it can be really deep and rich because people can really think about that. I've even done it where we actually take part of the evening, or if it's a Saturday, and have folks go out and walk around for half an hour with their little chart of the 6 assets and see what they see. Especially if it's a lot of adults, because they mostly drive by these assets. So having them walk can be really powerful to see things that they haven't seen. But being clear on the boundaries, and sometimes it's a whole city, and so it's hard to go in as much depth. And so in that case, you want to provide some topical boundaries, and Dante's example will speak to that. But they talked about what are the assets in our city for climate action. But providing some boundaries so people are working on the same page. And then doing the mapping. The way that I usually do this is I'll divide people into 6 groups and assign each group an asset category. I usually have the asset categories on large flip charts around the room. And so there'll be a flip chart that says individuals, and there'll be a flip chart that says associations, and a flip chart that says institutions, and one that says physical assets, one that says local economy, and one that says culture and stories. And they're spread around the room, and I have each group go to one of those categories. And I'll say, okay, take the next 5 or 6 minutes as a group to write all the assets in that category that can be found in the defined boundaries that we just talked about. With individuals, I don't have them try to name every person in their neighborhood. I have them focus on connector leaders. We talk a little bit about what a connector leader is and who those people are. And then I usually, me and the agency facilitator usually walk around and sort of just help people think about, what this category is. Takes a little while for culture and stories to get going, but once they do, they take off. Then in about 5 minutes, I ring a bell and have them rotate. So the people who are doing individuals go to associations, people who are doing associations go to institutions, and so on. And then we just keep repeating that. As we do future rounds, I start to shorten the time to 4 and 3 minutes, just because they come there, they read what other people have done, and then add to it. And it keeps it moving. And then repeat this until all the groups have added to all the asset categories. And usually by now you've usually got 2 to 4 flip sheets full of stuff. And you'll start to maybe point out to them that there are many assets that fit in many categories. So a school is a physical space that is also an institution. And often at the school, there are associations like parent-teacher group or a running club or things like that. Then I have them rotate one last time so they end up at the category where they started, and I ask each group to read what's on there, see what's been added since they were there 20 minutes ago, and then ask a representative from each area to read the assets from the category to the whole room. And sometimes people want to recategorize, like, oh, that's more of an institution, that's an association, and oh, that made us remember something over in local economy, let's put it there. So it's sort of a group process of filling out the sheets. And it will, as a facilitator and somebody who knew this was coming, it will feel a little redundant and long to you. So that's just a warning of process. But I always find that it has the cumulative effect of everybody hearing out loud the assets of the community for about 20 minutes. It's about 2 to 3 minutes per page or per asset, is super powerful. And so I encourage you to stick with that process. And then once all the assets have been read, I ask for the group's reactions. And most of the time they'll share what I talked about earlier, some sense of amazement about their community, pride in their town. They'll use words like abundance and overwhelmed with goodness, opportunity, and they start thinking of what they want for their community in terms of what they have to get what they want for their community. And so then I'll put people back at their tables in whatever group formations they want to be, and ask them the question, what could we do with what we have to blank? And this is where we recognize that a lot of times when an agency or institution is facilitating, they usually have something they need to get done. So with these public health groups I was talking about, they wanted to have a conversation with residents about how could we use our assets to make a healthier community. One of them, their health goal was to make their community child amazing, which I thought was pretty cool. And so we go ahead and put that in. With straight up community organizing and community engagement, you can just leave it as broad as what could we do with what we have to strengthen our community. And it can go a lot of directions. I've done that before. But that's the question they ask. After about 10 minutes or so, I'll ask them to identify 1 or 2 ideas they're particularly excited about and present those ideas with some description of them written on a piece of paper and taped to a wall. So basically the small groups go through some process of thinking about all the assets and what could be done with them and presenting a couple ideas, which then gives everyone else a chance to decide if that's an idea they resonate with and want to work on. And that becomes a key part of this asset mapping, and a key part of ABCD is to not try to talk people into working on something that they don't connect with or feel like they can contribute to. The idea here is to invite people to look at these ideas and say, what would you want to work on? And sort of relieves them of the burden of, quote, having to work on the most important thing, because that thing is often overwhelming. Let's reduce gang violence. I don't know how to reduce gang violence. But I do know how to go make that vacant lot a beautiful place. And I want to contribute to that because I like gardening. And so what you find is that people sort of self-filter out. And we also remind people it's okay not to go stand by an idea. Like, honor your limits if you're not in a place to do that. Or if you want to stand by an idea and say, this isn't something I can work on, but I want to stay connected to it when I can. And then I give each group, so now we're grouped by ideas of what can be done. And I give each group another piece of paper and say, identify the assets that could help you implement that action and make that change that you want to make. And write down when this group wants to meet next, who else needs to be here, and remind them that learning conversations, I think you guys have all been exposed to, are a critical part of the next step. I really encourage groups who say, we're going to meet next week. It's like, okay, maybe, but who's not here? And can you talk to them by next week? And if not, then maybe meet in 3 weeks. Because there's a key step in here, which is relationship building with the assets you need before you go further. And then I have them share out. Sometimes at this point, when a group says, okay, we're working on making the Broderick neighborhood more walkable, so people are out walking more because that will make us healthier. There's a long old history of this that went away. At a certain point, we want to recover that, and we think these assets will do it, and here's our plan. Somebody who was working on something else might say, actually, that's the one I want to work on. So it's very much kind of like open space, but it takes some permission giving as you go through as the facilitator. And then it's important to make sure that there's some celebration at the end and some indication of when you'll follow up and how that will happen. And then letting everybody see all the follow-up. So just because I was really into the walking group, later when I get the typed up flip charts and the action plans, I might say, you know what, I really want to work on that dirt bike course for kids as well, so I'm going to go to that meeting. So being transparent is good. I'm seeing in my slides here, my slide that introduced Danté fell out, or I didn't save it, dang it. So Danté, I'm gonna hand it to you to share your story, and then we've got some questions to help you guys dig in deeper.
Great, thank you, Ron. And Ellie, thank you for pulling up the presentation for today. But while Ellie is pulling up my presentation, I can talk a little bit about, you know, the work that brought me here today. So I was a community liaison for Woodland Park Zoo, and we were recipients of the IMLS grant for cohort 1. It was really exciting to be a part of that process. And basically our group's concern was, how can we mobilize climate action and engage youth in that climate action and connect them to resources from different nonprofits, institutions, and other groups that are within the city of Seattle. So, and also I apologize, I had to step away for a second. I won't have to on the phone, on the call today. But I am actually currently working in the Office of Emergency Management in Seattle, and things are getting a little busy with this virus that's been going around. People are asking a lot of questions about it. But yeah, so that's just a little bit about me. And I'm really excited to talk about this tool of asset mapping. It was something that was, I would say, transformational for our project in cohort 1. So yeah, we'll go on to slide 2. Great. So let me tell you a little bit about what SYCAN is. It stands for the Seattle Youth Climate Action Network. And one of the things that we were really trying to take initiative on doing was connecting this group of professionals, nonprofits across a lot of different sectors, and help connect their resources to students that wanted to take action on climate change. So these are some of the groups that were in the room. We had it was interesting in our project, we kind of had 2 communities. One community of these adults and people that were working in the sphere around climate action or had questions related to how to propel it. And then we had a group of students that we worked with much closely. So some of the key community connectors we had represented University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, King County Department of Natural Resources and Parks, looking at climate action and justice. But it was a really exciting opportunity. Now, we used, the pictures that you see here are actually from our first iteration of doing asset mapping with this group of folks. And our goal was to really figure out what can we do and what is possible to take action on climate change. So Ron actually helped us. You'll see him in the orange on the left picture there, helping us facilitate. I want you to take a look at this photo and look at some of the things that brought people together. One, we had food. We had a lot of food. We invited Yes, we had a lot of food. We actually created, we used a community asset that was owned by Seattle Aquarium to have this meeting space to start this conversation of what's possible. And this was the beginning of a second year of our project for students to get involved. So this was used as an event to get people excited, get people started, and to figure out what could be possible. But I took a couple of notes here just as Ron was talking too. We had a place, we had specific invitations that were sent, we had food, we brought other people on via social media. So we actually used Zoom. If you look on the television screen, we had people join that way. So we made it a very accessible space, a time that worked for people, and it was just a really exciting time. We'll go to the next slide. So what came out of this project was this word map. We went through the room to figure out what could be possible to take action on climate change. And there was a couple important things that made this happen. One is that we helped frame the boundaries for how we're taking action on climate change within Seattle. A lot of the times when people are writing things on the different boards around the room, we wanted to make sure it was kind of around climate action. It got really easy for folks to kind of go to the side and talk about environmental issues, maybe that weren't related to climate action, but we helped frame the boundary to climate action, which was really helpful. We had these two main groups of adults and students, so the age gap was pretty different. People were coming in from different angles, but we created a space that was equal and level. Like Ron said, we had usually about 2 to 3 students for every smaller group of adults. So each group that were rotating, they were rotating together with the adults in the room and the students. It was a level playing field. That was so important for us. Everyone had the gifts to offer, and we wanted to make sure that the students knew that they had a lot of assets, just like the adults in the room did too. This really helped harness our momentum. It was really exciting to show these assets around institutions, agencies, culture stories, associations, and places and spaces, and the group got really excited. This, and I'm actually going to be happy to, one thing I forgot to mention is that I'm happy to share kind of the type list of all of these assets and organized from the adults and students that were in the room that came up with these ideas. We'll go to the next slide. So like I said, our question was looking at all of these assets. There was so much potential. There were so much areas and names and associations and people that we could turn to. The question that we asked is, what is possible? Now, what was exciting about this is that it came out in 3 different areas from the group. The group came up and themselves figured out what were the common themes that came out of all these assets. They saw that there was a huge interest in talking about climate change and climate justice with schools, that there's ways that we can amplify existing community efforts around climate change, and also that there was a lot of interest and assets in the gifts that people were bringing in the room and people that they knew in the community around climate change and art. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the asset mapping led to one of the major projects that we did, which was around climate change and art installations. So that, with the timing that we had, climate change and the climate change and art group really formed into driving one of the major events. The students came up, with a community climate art series. They immediately started reaching out to their friends, pulling from the assets, looking at the places and spaces that they came up with. Who did they need to contact and how would it be possible? And they came up with a multi-community art series, which involved creating a mural and then having the community help create it, that projected climate justice and climate art. These are some pictures from one of the first events where they invited community members to come in to kind of do a paint by number of a collaborative art piece that really showed pulling the curtain back on climate change and showing a possibility for a more resilient climate future. And I'll be happy to share that final product as well with the group. something that we noticed in this, like I mentioned, is that this asset mapping really set the precedent for harnessing momentum, and it came with the students realizing the power that they had in such a huge topic like climate change, that they actually had some power to take action. Some of the most amazing things that happened out of this is that after these meetings happened, some of the students then identified their own smaller breakout groups. They created own smaller minor community, other communities where they collaborated with their friends immediately at the school. They reached out to their different local school clubs and groups, and then they created conversations that didn't exist before the asset mapping process. Something that I do want to mention about this, some of my biggest lessons learned from this process, just like Ron said, is follow-up is extremely important. Because this momentum was so powerful in the beginning, you want to make sure that you do follow up and you help give them the tools to continue that facilitation and momentum. Something that I wish that I did in my position was to help a little bit more with that follow-up, because once the momentum's there, but you want to make sure you keep on going with it, with communication and facilitation with that group. You want to consider timing of when this asset mapping happens. So something that was a challenge for our group was figuring out times and places to meet. Just to give you a scope of where these students and these institutions and associations were located, we're talking about the whole city of Seattle. So the farthest distance between one student and another student could actually be 20 miles. So it was a large group, very widespread. So coming up with times and places to meet, what took a lot of energy to figure out where do we do this asset mapping and how do we tackle such a big topic. But this was so helpful for us in kind of reaching a final, point for catalyzing action. If we go to the next slide, I do want to talk briefly about, we actually use this tool internally as well. So when I say internally, we looked at Woodland Park Zoo. If our communities are doing so much action around this, how can we use this tool internally across our own departments to kind of catalyze the momentum? So for Woodland Park Zoo, we had a lot of different folks from different levels of from a vice president kind of level down to even, kind of volunteer kind of level for people to be involved in this process. So SYCAN, when we say SYCAN, that would be the Seattle Youth Climate Action Network. That would be me and some other coworkers that were representing, climate action interest around that. But we wanted to see how can we use this tool internally to kind of make our efforts for our community stronger. If you go to the next slide, these are some of the kind of things that we came up with. Is a kind of a similar thing. This word map was very helpful for us to see what we can do around climate action as an institution in collaboration with our community. So how can our institutional assets be leveraged also to help for the community that we were working with? So the products of this were actually also given with our community to show them some of the assets that maybe we have that we came up with in the room that we can further connect them to as well. If you go to the next slide, we also figured out what would be possible with these. The possibilities around all of the assets that we came up with helped us show that we can connect our animals to climate change, our audience to climate change, and also it can help us develop more of a strategy for how we can be engaging our communities better to linking short and long-term strategies around climate change and possibly be a leader. A lot of this work actually helped develop a foundation for how we can develop, how we were able to develop our climate change capital campaign initiative. So when we had huge fundraising goals as an institution, this actually helped catalyze momentum there as well. Now, one slide that I didn't get to put in here quite in time, but I do want to stress some of the big kind of major takeaways we had from this process. Number one, doing this with our community and also internally, it really helped us harness momentum around the topic. This is a great tool to use in the beginning of a project. and to get people excited to realize the potential that they have to take on large problems like climate change, and that there is a lot of possibility. A lot of the students coming in wanted to do something, but the idea of climate change was scary. They're involved in this because what they see portrayed in the media, seeing with natural disasters and how people are being displaced, they wanted to take action, but being able to do that for them in the beginning, before this process, they just saw a lot of gap. This showed the opportunity of what they can do to move the needle. Following up is extremely important when it comes to asset mapping, and considering timing for your community to do this was also really important. Helping facilitate and frame kind of the wide net of the assets that they have, and to kind of help facilitate it down to major goals is also extremely important. And then also just realizing that this is an iterative process. It's not just a one-time, something that if I were involved in the project for a second year, I would love to redo this project and revisit it. What I will say is I did talk to the current program coordinator that's overseeing the program now, and they are in the process of starting to identify assets and begin a new year to identify what their goals are. And this was a huge a huge tool for momentum to build. On the last slide, it shows some contact information outside of myself. But if you want to figure out kind of where the project is going for 2020, the best person to reach out to would be Josiah Downey. He is the Youth and Adult Engagement Manager at Woodland Park Zoo that is overseeing SYCAN. It is still continuing, and they are really excited to continue a new year to see what's possible to take action on climate change. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions, depending on our call right now. But also, if you wanted to reach out to me, we can send that information if I wanted to provide any more sharing of information. But that's a little bit about how we used asset mapping in our community to take action on climate change. It is something that one of the proudest moments I had in the program was seeing everyone in the room working together across institutions, with different boundaries of, taking down barriers of age, and even between the government and nonprofit level. It's just really exciting to see how this tool can be used. With that said, sorry, I know I kind of ramble a little bit. I can open up the floor to questions, but also I'll kind of bring it back to Ellie and Ron for the trajectory of the meeting to see what we'll be doing next.
I think at this point, our plan was to give you guys a chance to talk in some small groups. I've got some questions here that I can share. Are you seeing that? Sorry, my sound went off for a second. So can you see the small groups round, Ellie?
Yes. Can you hit the full screen button so everyone can see it?
I can try. Did that do it?
Perfect.
So the idea is to give you a chance to talk with your peers, maybe in groups of 4 or so, around what you can use from this model or what seems challenging or difficult, and then we'll bring those out to the large group. As well as, so those two, questions 1 and 2 kind of go together, what works, doesn't work about this model, and then 3 and 4, how could you possibly use asset mapping going forward, and is there anything in particular that would help you facilitate a process? So can we just hear from somebody from each group around your conversation, which questions you worked on and what kind of answers you came up with?
I guess we're group 1, and this is Akila speaking. So if they don't mind, I'll talk about what we talked about. We didn't have the questions, but we kind of just talked about where asset mapping fits into our projects. And I'm working with the peer mentoring group for girls with the Athens-Clarke County Library that we're implementing to basically just give girls the tools to become organizational leaders in their schools and communities. So one of the things that we did as far as incorporating asset mapping into our project is really honing in on the community engagement piece of our project. And having girls, it started with just having girls identify some of the dreams and goals that women and girls have in their community, but then going even further to say, okay, well, what are some of the barriers that we have? And the girls were able to identify these things, and when we were able to say, okay, so based on the barriers and the dreams and goals that women and girls have, these are some of the great things that are going on in the community, organizations, services that are being offered, that are here that we can access and tap into and invite into our space.
Yeah, this is Emiliano. We are group 2, and one of the things we talked about was, well, I personally am working on a farmers market, on opening a farmers market here in the city where I'm at, and I was not sure how to use the context of asset mapping with a business. And when I say a business, I mean like where there is like a clear vision of where we're going, and getting a lot of input but not being able to implement a lot of those things might defy the purpose of having an asset mapping for the people, because they're like, oh, if you're not going to implement a lot of these things, then why are we doing it? So that was a challenge that we were seeing. But then one of my group members shared that it could be an interesting idea to invite the neighbors, the people the stakeholders that might benefit, that are going to benefit from having a closed farmers market, and have them come to a meeting and talk about specifically about the market, like what are some of the things they would like, and seeing that. I don't know if that would still be an asset. It would still be considered an asset mapping.
That would be different. That would be a great way of engaging community around what they want from a farmer's market. The asset mapping piece would be more about looking at what the community assets are that could be part of that, and what other people have to contribute.
Yeah, so it'd be a little different.
Yeah. Still really useful. I worked in one community where they had a broader question, which was just promoting healthy living, and how could they use community assets. And I think part of the magic of this process is that you back out a ways and just look at community assets together. You don't narrow it to how can we use our assets to reduce youth violence or make healthier living or all that. You just kind of look at all the assets first. And that also enables people to engage more, because they don't have to have solutions. They just have to know what's in their community and what they experience in their community. Then after you look at all the assets, you say, what's possible for us, especially around whatever issue is. So this community said around healthy living. And that's where a lot of folks came together around creating a common place and space for people to share their gifts, for people who grew food to offer it, for people who knew cooking to offer ways to cook the various food. And essentially what emerged was sort of a quasi farmers market. But they didn't start with how could we use our assets to create a farmers market. They started with what assets do we have, and what could we do with them to create healthier living. And then this Saturday gathering thing really came out of it, that involved farmers market type activities, but other things too, including some games area for kids. So, because there's people
a clarifying question about that.
Yeah.
So you do the asset mapping, and then there's the step that says, so what can we do with what we have to blank?
Yeah.
But at the beginning, you're going to frame the conversation in some way, right? So you're using a prescribed geographic area. In the zoo example, it was upfront that people knew that they were going to be addressing issues of climate change or climate justice. I'm assuming that was like up front, because the people, the adults who had all been invited were all in that sector. So what's the relationship between the frame at the top, where people come in and they know already what issue they're all there for, and you know what I mean? And then like waiting.
So in that case, because the geography was so broad, we had to put some of that framing up front. And then, so we did it was almost inverse, right? So we did some of the framing up front. What are the assets in Seattle that might be useful to climate change? Just to bring it down, because we didn't have the time or capacity to do all the assets of the entire region of Seattle. And then we looked at them and said, okay, which of these, do you want to use? Or what could, looking at all these, what could you do? And then the kids came up with some art, creative-based work. They came up with connecting with clubs at schools and connecting them to some of these other assets. And there was a third area, I can't remember now. Even that was narrowed down somewhat. I can't see if Dante's still there, but the SYCAN had this tradition of doing an annual youth climate summit. And when we first started talking about asset mapping, and certainly the folks before Dante came on saw asset mapping as a way to find out the resources that could be used to pull off the next successful youth climate summit. Dante and his team were willing to not be that pointed in the inquiry question, which led them to discover that the kids didn't want to do a youth climate summit. Even though there was a million assets on the wall that could have been used for that, they wanted to do some other things and have more localized, focused action. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to the, with a big geography, you do have to invert that equation a little bit.
I agree with what Ron said. It was actually a perfect representation. And that third area was try to amplify community efforts too. So yeah, it was used. We did give, in a sense, a general category, because they were already gathered. They were already a part of the work with SYCAN, because they wanted to take action on climate change. So the question that they were trying to answer is, what could we do in regards to that?
Thanks. I asked just because I think that's probably similar to a lot of us in our projects, where we are already working in a prescribed area or under a prescribed mission of some kind. And so whatever, so that was useful.
Yeah. And you want to be transparent about that. At the same time, as much as you can open it up as possible, the more likely it is you'll discover things you hadn't noticed before. And that's sort of one of the key contributions asset mapping often makes to a process, is helps us see what we didn't see before. That's also driven not just by the question, but by who you have in the room. So the broader and deeper your recruiting goes to that process, the better tools you get from it. I'm sorry, Dante, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a very small thing to add. Something that's worth noting, which I won't talk too much about that, but I had to deal with the development of our logic model that was informed by the community that came into the room. So a lot of those driving actions, they determined those actions already before the asset mapping happened. So they figured out what were their goals and objectives for the year, and then they used the asset mapping to help answer the objectives that they came up with and worked on with us on for their logic model.
I have to put an asterisk there because Dante and his crew actually facilitated the youth developing their logic model.
Mm-hmm. It was scary for sure, but it was amazing. So on a side note, if anyone has any questions about that process, I'm happy to explain the good and the things that were challenging from that too.
Did we get the third group to report?
They're up next.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Do the rest of y'all mind if I speak? Okay, cool. So I was really excited because I got to spend 10 minutes chatting with library professionals, some of my favorite people in the world. And So we talked a lot about like ways that we are thinking about using asset maps. There was a difference of experience with them, but there was a lot that came up around using these to inform projects and programs that are emerging and are in development, such as like planning for a new library branch and what that might mean for the community, and how an asset mapping or series of asset mapping activities and convenings could be really helpful and informative for that, and also how to use it to flesh out ongoing work with different community groups and organizations. And some of the challenges that arose for us in talking about this, the first one was really that follow-up is absolutely key, and yet we're all so incredibly busy, and it can be hard to do that. And so how to circle back with and re-engage people maybe when it's been a minute or two since you've really actively talked with them. And then one question, and I will own this as mine, is around strategies for mitigating what might possibly be power dynamics in an asset mapping session. And Danté, this particularly came to mind for me with how do you make sure that the youth voice is amplified in an asset mapping session, and that someone who perceives themselves as an expert or a leader doesn't dominate the conversation?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. It was something that I initially was a little bit worried about. What I will say is that there were some folks that were in the room that worked with students. So there's, I'd say about half of our adult group worked with youth development. And those folks and myself, having been a teacher, we kind of helped use that information in our facilitation to open that space. So really thinking about folks that work with the audience that you're trying to prevent from not having that voice shared. You know, so I really relied on, I'd say, those kind of youth development specialists to kind of open it up. We also used that, you know, if there's a chance to, having almost a second conversation, or we called them our steering committee. It wasn't a steering committee. I'll just say these group of organizations. We kind of explained what our goals were to amplify them to be on that same level. We set the precedent coming in that we all have assets and gifts to share equally. And that was very helpful for us, very helpful framing. But I will say we did have the benefit of having a lot of the adults in the room work with youth development already. So if you can identify those folks that are a part of the group and really kind of leverage on truly their asset and their gift of being able to help facilitate, it's very helpful. We had two community connectors in particular that helped us with that conversation. One that worked with students and one that didn't, and they also helped. So
I think also we prepped the adults a little bit before and said, you know, this is going to happen. We're going to end up in some small groups around assets, and you're going to travel with the group. And so make sure your role is to facilitate their voice.
Yes.
So with youth, we tried to get the adults to be really intentional.
One thing we noticed is that the students, you know, in previous situations, they sometimes can be afraid to share when there's adults in the room. We did set that precedent at the beginning, like, you know, we all have gifts, and yeah, so we had the prep with the adults, and then the constant, you know, the constant reminder of what ABCD is all about.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's really helpful.
I think on your other point, just remembering that asset mapping is a beginning of a process.
Yeah.
So it's not it's not a just extractive data gathering for agencies to find out things and then go use them. That would be, I think, a really inappropriate use of it. But it's a beginning of relationship building and helping folks in the room determine some direction that they can take, that the agency who's facilitating might partner with them on. It's not uncommon, in my experience, for out of an asset mapping session like we talked about, for several groups to move forward, some of which connect to what the facilitating agency wants to do, and then they stay connected, and others which don't connect, and that's fine. To just provide something. What happens is those folks do remember that you, the library or the Chamber of Commerce or the youth development group who was hosting this, helped them connect that way, and it creates a deeper relationship for the future. But you don't have to pursue every project that comes out of it, and just being open about that is important. But definitely don't do it if you don't think you'll have any time to follow up with the relationship.
Thank you for inviting me to talk.
Thanks, Dante, for pitching in here.
I'm very excited for all the work that you're doing. I think this is a really exciting opportunity, funding opportunity to really catalyze action in your communities.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.